I can't let him catch me, I whispered under my breath, my heels clicking frantically against the polished marble of the office lobby as rain pelted the glass walls outside like tiny drumbeats. My chest heaved with every breath, the adrenaline in my veins making my limbs feel simultaneously heavy and electric. Papers flew from my bag as I bolted toward the elevator, and I barely noticed the receptionist's startled gasp behind me. I pressed the button desperately, watching the numbers tick upward with agonizing slowness, each beep echoing in my ears like a countdown. When the doors finally slid open, I darted inside and pressed the highest floor button, my reflection in the mirrored walls showing wide green eyes and damp strands of hair plastered to my face. The elevator hummed upward, and I could feel the pounding of my own heart loud enough to drown out the storm outside. When the doors opened, I ran without thinking, skidding slightly on the slick floor of the executive corridor. That's when I saw him. Lucas Romano, standing behind his enormous mahogany desk, dark hair perfectly combed, eyes storm blue and piercing. He didn't flinch, didn't even raise his brows, yet the aura around him made the space feel smaller, heavier, as if the air itself obeyed him. "Emily?" His voice was calm, precise, but there was an undertone that made my muscles freeze. I wanted to explain, to say something, but my voice had been swallowed by the panic still thrumming through me. He rose from his chair with a fluid grace, each step deliberate, and I could feel the weight of his presence pushing back against my fear. "I'll handle this," he said, his tone low and unwavering, and in that moment the world narrowed down to the space between us, the tension like a live wire stretching taut. I glanced over my shoulder, knowing my ex could be anywhere, but Lucas's eyes never left mine, assessing, calculating, protective. The scent of his cologne hit me, sharp, commanding, a strange comfort amidst the chaos. I tried to steady my breath, to move, to think, but my legs refused, anchored by the certainty that whatever was coming, he would control it. The elevator doors had sealed us from the hall behind, and yet the storm outside seemed to follow, a rhythmic thrum of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Lucas took a measured step closer, his presence a shield I hadn't asked for but couldn't deny, his hand brushing mine just enough to anchor me without crossing a line. The hum of the air conditioning and the distant thunder created a backdrop to the sharp clarity of his control, a calm certainty against the panic that still clung to me. I could feel the edge of relief start to bloom, hesitant and fragile, as he motioned toward the corner office window, gesturing me behind it, safe for now, shielded from whatever threat lurked beyond the glass. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but now I was running with him, not from him, and the strange tension in my chest twisted, confusion and awe tangled together. He didn't speak again, just moved with precise intent, scanning the corridor outside before allowing me a breath to collect myself, his eyes never leaving mine, silently promising control, protection, and a certainty I had never known. The rain outside blurred against the glass, turning the city lights into molten streaks, and I realized, for the first time since I'd fled, that the worst of the storm might not be outside, it might be standing calmly beside me, watching, waiting, and keeping me safe. The storm outside seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own racing heart as Lucas guided me across the office floor, each step measured, controlled, yet undeniably powerful. My palms were damp from gripping the edges of my jacket, my green eyes darting to every reflective surface, catching brief glimpses of our shadows stretching long across the polished hardwood. He moved without hesitation toward the corner of the office, where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the rain-slicked streets below. The city lights smeared into golden streaks against the dark asphalt, creating a surreal canvas that made the danger outside feel simultaneously distant and immediate. Lucas's voice, calm and steady, broke the tense silence. "You need to stay close to me," he said, the words carrying an authority that made me instinctively obey. I followed him, every step cautious, aware that my own fear was still a living, tangible presence in the room. His gaze flicked toward the corridor doors, scanning, calculating, and I realized that he was not only protecting me but also reading the space, anticipating every possible risk. The air between us was charged, not with chaos, but with a potent mixture of assurance and ownership that made my pulse spike anew. I could feel the weight of his presence behind me, like a shield, a boundary that no threat could cross without his awareness. As he moved closer to the window, he gestured subtly with a hand for me to look outside, and I hesitated, my chest tightening, until I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving along the building perimeter. I swallowed hard, the knot in my stomach loosening slightly with the knowledge that Lucas had already seen it, already planned for it. He did not rush, his movements deliberate, his calmness a stark contrast to my frantic state, and yet it made the room feel safe, almost anchored. I dared to breathe more evenly as he turned slightly, his storm blue eyes locking onto mine, assessing, reassuring, commanding all at once. "It is all right," he said quietly, and for the first time since I had run through the lobby, the fear that had clawed at my chest began to ebb. I noticed the small details, the way the light caught the edges of his tailored suit, the gentle but firm way his fingers brushed against the edge of my arm to guide me without force. Everything about him communicated safety and control, an unspoken promise that the storm outside, no matter how relentless, was being contained within the walls he dominated. I found myself moving instinctively with him, following his lead, each step solidifying a strange, fragile trust. The distant hum of the city below, mixed with the rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass, created a soundtrack that heightened every sense, making the tactile feel of my shoes against the floor, the slickness of my jacket, and the warmth of his proximity more pronounced. I could feel the tension in my muscles gradually releasing as he positioned me behind a large potted plant, providing cover without a word, his eyes sweeping the corridor again before finally resting on me. He tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the way I was absorbing every movement, every gesture, every calculated pause, and I understood without needing explanation that he was fully in control and that he had claimed responsibility for my safety. For the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed a breath to escape freely, my body relaxing just enough to recognize the surrealness of the moment. Lucas remained close, but not imposing, a silent guardian against the unknown. The storm outside, the city lights, and my own frayed nerves seemed to coalesce into a single instant of clarity, one that was anchored entirely by his presence, and as I looked up at him, I realized that while I had run into the office seeking refuge, I had not just found safety, I had found a man who would not let the chaos touch me. Lucas moved toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette framed by the rain-streaked glass, and gestured for me to stay behind the potted plant as he scanned the hallway again. The city outside was a blur of neon reflections and wet asphalt, each vehicle's headlights smearing into long streaks, casting an almost surreal glow over the room. I could feel my hands trembling slightly, not from the cold but from the lingering adrenaline of the chase that had brought me here. Lucas's eyes never left the corridor, taking in every detail, noting every shadow, every potential movement of the streets below. The quiet hum of the office air conditioning blended with the rhythmic patter of the storm, creating a soundtrack that made the room feel suspended in time, isolated from everything else. "You are safe here," he said, his voice low, precise, and carrying the kind of authority that left no room for doubt. I nodded, my breath still shallow, absorbing both the words and the assurance behind them. He moved with careful steps back toward the desk, retrieving a sleek black tablet from a drawer and tapping through messages, glancing occasionally toward me as if checking my state, all while maintaining a calm presence that contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. I watched him, mesmerized by the fluidity of his movements, the quiet confidence that radiated from his posture and gestures, and I realized that he was not only protecting me physically but also creating a space where my mind could begin to relax, where the panic of being pursued began to fade. The storm had become a distant backdrop, almost cinematic, as Lucas positioned himself between me and the hallway once again, offering a subtle, silent promise that whatever had been chasing me, whatever had made my heart pound uncontrollably just moments ago, would not cross this threshold. I allowed myself to breathe more fully, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly as I observed the small details, the way his tailored suit caught the soft office light, the measured precision in every movement, the faint scent of his cologne that seemed to blend strength and reassurance into a tangible presence. Outside, the city continued in its stormy rhythm, cars splashing through puddles, lights refracting through rain, but inside, the office had become a sanctuary, an arena of control where Lucas was the anchor, the one constant in a world that had felt unpredictable and threatening just moments before. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and I understood it as permission to move closer, to allow a little more confidence to creep into my steps, to trust that for now, I was protected. Every detail of the room, the polished floors, the muted hum of electronics, the faint scent of rain through slightly opened windows, seemed to emphasize the contrast between the storm outside and the composed, unshakable presence of Lucas within, and I realized that I was beginning to feel something I had not felt for hours, perhaps days, a fragile but undeniable sense of security, guided entirely by his steady, commanding presence. I could feel the tension slowly ebbing, replaced by a cautious curiosity as Lucas guided me toward a seating area near the corner windows. The polished leather chairs gleamed under the soft overhead lighting, and the faint smell of rain mixed with the subtle aroma of his cologne hung in the air like an invisible tether connecting us. I sank into one of the chairs, still alert, my fingers clutching the edge of the armrest, but the tight knot of fear in my chest had loosened, replaced by a tentative awareness that I was under his protection. Lucas remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the back of the nearest chair, his posture relaxed yet commanding, eyes sweeping the room and corridor beyond in a silent assessment that left no doubt he had control of the space. The hum of the air conditioning, the gentle tapping of rain on the windows, and the distant sounds of traffic created a serene backdrop, allowing my mind to process the rapid sequence of events that had led me here. Lucas's gaze shifted from the corridor to me, a subtle flicker of concern passing through his storm-blue eyes, and he inclined his head slightly as if to signal reassurance without needing words. I swallowed, my throat dry, and managed a small nod, sensing the unspoken communication that carried weight far beyond its simplicity. He stepped closer, and I became acutely aware of every detail, the tailored cut of his suit, the precise line of his shoulders, the way his presence seemed to fill the room without overwhelming it, creating a protective bubble that I could feel in the slight brush of air around him. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the glass with a steady rhythm, yet inside the office, the world felt suspended, controlled, as if the storm had been contained by his steady presence. Lucas gestured subtly toward the window ledge, inviting me to glance outside, and I saw the city glistening beneath the rain, neon lights reflecting in puddles, turning familiar streets into a fluid painting of color and light. He did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch, and in that quiet, I became acutely aware of the way my own breathing had slowed, how my heartbeat no longer screamed in panic but settled into a more even rhythm, mirroring his calm. He finally spoke, his voice low and precise, carrying an authority that was soothing without commanding obedience. "You can trust that you are safe," he said, the words simple, yet imbued with an assurance that made my shoulders relax fractionally. I found myself allowing a small exhale, the tension in my hands easing as I adjusted my position in the chair, feeling the first real sense of security since the chase had begun. Lucas continued to observe, his eyes flicking briefly to the corridor, then returning to me, acknowledging without intrusion the fragile trust one was offering. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm, cars moving through rain-slick streets, streetlights flickering against wet asphalt, but inside, in this controlled sanctuary, I felt anchored, every element, the lighting, the sound, the rain, and Lucas's presence, contributing to a cocoon of safety, a pause in the chaos, a moment where I could simply exist without fear, guided entirely by the calm, unwavering vigilance of the man who had claimed responsibility for my protection. I watched as Lucas moved to the side of the office, his gaze fixed on the corridor, scanning every corner with meticulous precision, and I realized how fully he had claimed control of the space, not with force, but with an unspoken authority that left me feeling both protected and accountable to his calm vigilance. The rain continued its steady drum against the glass, but inside, the room had transformed into a bubble of measured safety, a stark contrast to the frantic rush that had propelled me through the lobby moments ago. My hands had finally stopped shaking, and I allowed myself a small exhale, feeling the tight knot of adrenaline slowly unwind. Lucas turned slightly toward me, the soft glow of the office lighting highlighting the sharp lines of his face and the subtle shadows beneath his storm-blue eyes, and he gave a barely perceptible nod, as if acknowledging the fragility of my trust and encouraging me to relax without words. I took a careful step forward, moving toward the desk, my gaze flitting to the city outside, where the streets shimmered with reflections of neon and rain, each movement of a vehicle painting streaks of light that made the scene feel almost dreamlike. Lucas observed me silently, his stance relaxed yet commanding, radiating a controlled energy that filled the room, and I felt the weight of his presence like a tether, steadying me, holding me safe without a single intrusive gesture. The subtle sound of my own breathing, the soft rustle of fabric as I shifted in the chair, and the distant hum of the air conditioning became part of a rhythm, an unspoken cadence in the quiet moment where I could feel the edges of fear softening. Lucas stepped closer, the faint scent of his cologne blending with the freshness of the rain filtering through slightly opened windows, a grounding presence in the surreal clarity of the office environment. He gestured toward the cityscape with a small tilt of his hand, inviting me to take in the view, and as I did, I felt a peculiar sense of perspective, of distance from the chaos that had chased me here, as if the city itself had paused to accommodate this instant of calm. His eyes returned to mine, steady and unwavering, and in that look, I understood not only his protective role but also the careful way he measured his interactions, providing reassurance without overwhelming, control without oppression, and guidance without intrusion. I sank slightly into the chair, feeling the leather yielding beneath me, and allowed myself to notice details I had missed before, the subtle gleam of the desk surface, the soft reflection of the office lights in the glass, the faint echo of rain on the marble floors below, and for the first time, the panic that had gripped me felt like a memory, distant and softened by the certainty of his presence. Lucas remained alert, poised, every movement precise, yet there was an ease in the space he created, a sanctuary shaped not by walls or barriers, but by his unwavering attention, and I realized that in this controlled moment, where the storm outside raged on unnoticed, I was beginning to trust, cautiously but undeniably, that I was safe, that I could breathe, and that the chaos of the day would be held at bay by the calm, measured assurance of the man standing beside me. The distant rumble of thunder faded as I allowed myself to settle deeper into the chair, Lucas remaining a few steps behind, a silent guardian whose presence seemed to pulse through the room with a measured calm. My eyes tracked the reflections on the polished hardwood floor, the golden light from the overhead fixtures mingling with the streaks of neon from the city outside, each movement in the rain-slick streets creating a liquid painting that made everything else feel surreal. Lucas's hand hovered near the edge of the desk, fingers brushing lightly against the surface, a subtle reminder of the control he maintained without overt force, and I could not help but feel the weight of that authority pressing in a comforting way, as though it had the power to shield the entire office from whatever lay beyond the walls. I shifted slightly, noticing how his posture remained relaxed yet alert, shoulders squared, head tilting only slightly as he scanned the corridor, eyes catching every subtle shadow, every shift in light, anticipating movement without needing to speak. The soft hum of the air conditioning became a rhythm alongside the steady drumming of rain against the window, a cadence that allowed my own breathing to slow, the panic that had driven me here receding with every deliberate movement of his gaze and body. Lucas took a deliberate step toward the small table by the window, tapping lightly on a sleek tablet, his attention divided seamlessly between digital information and the physical environment, a multitasking grace that seemed effortless yet commanded presence. I felt the subtle tension ease from my muscles as he gestured for me to follow, guiding me toward a vantage point where I could observe the city without feeling exposed, the tilt of his hand precise, the encouragement silent but undeniable. My eyes caught the rhythm of his movements, each step measured, his calm energy infusing the space, creating a sanctuary within the office walls, a cocoon where fear no longer dictated every decision. I inhaled deeply, the scent of rain mixing with the faint cologne lingering near him, a sensory anchor that grounded me even as the city outside continued its relentless rhythm. Lucas glanced at me briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement in his storm-blue eyes, and I felt a tentative surge of trust, fragile but unmistakable, as if in that moment the storm, the city, and every threat beyond these walls had been held at bay entirely by his presence. I allowed myself to move closer, each step deliberate, testing the boundaries of safety and control, my gaze drifting to the reflection of the room in the window, seeing the two of us framed by the cityscape, a study in contrast between calm authority and residual tension. Lucas tilted his head slightly, a silent question in his expression, and I responded with the slightest nod, understanding that this was as much about my choice to trust as it was his protection. The office, the rain, the distant lights, and Lucas's unwavering vigilance combined into a moment of clarity, a suspended instant where fear and relief mingled, where I could finally feel the weight of security in a world that had moments before felt overwhelming and chaotic. Every subtle motion of his body, the placement of his feet, the quiet assessment of space, was an unspoken message. I was not alone, I was not exposed, and for now, I was safe. The faint sound of water dripping from the ceiling near the window pane joined the rhythm of the storm outside, and I found myself inching slightly closer to Lucas, drawn by the steady assurance of his presence. Every movement he made was deliberate, a choreography of control and calm that seemed to slow the pulse of the world around us. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow slip through the corridor, but the space remained empty, silent except for the rain and distant city hum. Lucas turned his attention to me, his storm blue eyes locking with my green ones, and in that moment, the subtle intensity of his gaze conveyed an unspoken promise that he would not allow anything to cross the threshold into this room. I felt a flutter of relief, the tension that had coiled tightly in my shoulders beginning to unwind, replaced by a tentative curiosity, a willingness to trust. He gestured toward the city skyline with a quiet sweep of his hand, the motion smooth and controlled, inviting me to see beyond the immediate threat, to observe the rain glinting off the streets below, the neon reflections stretching into liquid lines of color. I followed his gesture, allowing my gaze to take in the panorama, feeling a small measure of calm settle over me. The storm outside continued unabated, each drop striking the glass with persistent rhythm, yet within the office, a bubble of stillness persisted, anchored entirely by Lucas's watchful presence. He did not speak immediately, letting the silence expand, giving me space to absorb the strange contrast between the chaos I had fled and the composed, measured control surrounding me. I felt the subtle shift in the room, the way light and shadow played across his features, emphasizing both strength and attentiveness, and I realized that he had created a space where fear could be acknowledged without dominating, where I could breathe and think even as the city outside raged. A soft click of his shoes on the floor as he moved closer brought my attention back to him, and I noticed the careful way he gauged my reaction, his awareness of my state almost tangible, a silent monitoring that reassured more effectively than words ever could. I allowed myself a slow exhale, feeling the tension in my hands and neck ease, the knot of adrenaline unraveling in the presence of someone who had not only predicted but contained the storm. His voice finally broke the quiet, low and precise, "It is all right. You are safe," and the simplicity of the words, coupled with the unwavering steadiness of his stance, wrapped around me like a shield. I shifted slightly in my chair, letting my fingers trace the edge of the armrest, absorbing the subtle details of the office, the polished surfaces, the soft lighting, the faint scent of rain through the slightly open windows, and I understood, in a way that required no explanation, that for this moment, the world outside could remain unpredictable, but inside this controlled environment, I was anchored, guided entirely by his presence and the quiet, unyielding assurance that came from being seen and protected in every subtle gesture he made. The rain outside had slowed to a steady drizzle, streaking the glass with softer lines that blurred the city lights into gentle ribbons of gold and blue, and I found myself taking in the panorama with a cautious sense of wonder, noticing how the wet streets reflected every passing car like a liquid mirror. Lucas remained near the desk, his eyes sweeping the office with methodical precision, yet his attention was never far from me, the subtle shifts of his stance and the minimal tilt of his head communicating more than words could capture. I shifted slightly in my chair, feeling the soft leather beneath me, and allowed my gaze to trace the lines of the office, the polished surfaces, the carefully arranged decor, the muted hum of the air conditioning, each detail contributing to a sense of calm and order that I had not felt in hours. Lucas gestured toward a small seating area closer to the windows, a quiet invitation for me to move, and I rose cautiously, my hands brushing lightly against the cool metal of the window frame as I approached, feeling the faint vibration of the city beneath my feet. He gave a barely perceptible nod, the smallest sign of approval, and I realized in that instant that every gesture, every pause, and every glance was a part of a carefully orchestrated rhythm, designed to instill confidence without ever demanding it. The light from the city mixed with the residual glow of the office lamps, painting soft reflections across the surfaces and creating a calm, almost cinematic atmosphere, where every shadow and highlight seemed deliberately placed to reinforce the sense of safety and observation. Lucas stepped beside me, his presence steady and grounding, the faint scent of his cologne blending with the freshness of rain that had seeped through the slightly opened window, creating an anchor for my frayed nerves. "Look at the streets," he said quietly, his tone carrying a weight of experience and care. "Even when everything seems chaotic, there are patterns, order hidden in the movement." I watched the distant traffic and pedestrians, noticing the subtle ebb and flow, the predictability in the rhythm, and the metaphor for the control he maintained within the office struck me. He did not touch or restrain, yet I felt an undeniable tether to the assurance he provided, a protective presence that allowed me to move freely yet feel safe in the boundaries he set with quiet authority. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension in my shoulders ease, my heartbeat finding a calmer rhythm in tandem with the measured calm around me. Lucas's storm blue eyes flicked to mine, reading subtle micro-expressions, gauging my emotional state, and in that look, I understood a complex language of safety and intent without a single word being spoken. The rain continued its soft drum, the city hummed below, yet inside, in the cocoon of the office, time seemed to slow, every sound magnified yet harmonized, and I realized that the moment was not just about avoiding immediate danger but experiencing a space where I could breathe, observe, and trust completely in the presence of someone who had claimed responsibility for my safety, guiding me with precision, attentiveness, and unwavering assurance through the storm that raged both outside and within. The storm had finally begun to soften into a gentle drizzle, and the office seemed bathed in a serene glow, the reflections of city lights dancing across the rain-slick windows, turning the streets below into ribbons of shifting color. I remained near the corner seating area, Lucas a few steps behind, his presence a constant, steadying force, and I realized that the fear and adrenaline that had propelled me through the day had transformed into something altogether different, a profound sense of calm grounded in the certainty of his watchful attention. He moved with deliberate grace to a vantage point near the center of the room, his storm blue eyes scanning every angle, every possible entrance, ensuring that the office remained a sanctuary for the moment. I observed the subtle gestures, the way his hands rested lightly on the polished surfaces, the slight tilt of his head as he assessed the room, and I understood that the control he exercised was not just physical but psychological, creating a space where I could breathe freely, think clearly, and feel a sense of safety I had not known in hours. The hum of the air conditioning, the soft tapping of rain, and the distant city noises formed a rhythm, a background that made every movement he made resonate with purpose and authority, anchoring the room in calm precision. I allowed myself to step closer, guided by an instinctive trust that had been slowly forming. Through every measured action and every subtle acknowledgement from him. Lucas glanced briefly toward me, his expression unchanging yet conveying a depth of awareness that made words unnecessary, and I felt the invisible tether of assurance strengthen, a connection built on the quiet certainty that he had claimed responsibility for my safety. The light from the office lamps reflected softly off the polished wood and glass, creating a warm, almost cinematic ambience, emphasizing the contrast between the calm within and the lingering storm outside. I noticed the way he subtly shifted his stance, his posture conveying readiness without tension, a silent message that I could move, could breathe, could exist within this space, yet he would remain alert and unwavering. As I settled slightly into the chair, allowing the tension in my shoulders to ease further, I observed the city through the glass, the wet streets reflecting the streetlights like liquid gold, and I realized that this moment of stillness, this controlled pause, was an extension of the protection he offered, an unspoken promise that I was no longer at the mercy of panic or uncertainty. Lucas moved a step closer, a shadow crossing the floor between us, and I felt the anchoring of his presence more acutely, the subtle assurance that I could relax, observe, and trust entirely. The storm had softened, the city pulsed beneath us with its usual rhythm, yet inside, time seemed suspended, every detail, light, sound, and presence, coalescing into a cocoon of security. I exhaled fully, my chest no longer tight, my mind no longer racing, as I allowed the depth of that